Hello, my name is Mark Cogsall. I'm a researcher at the University of Missouri in Columbia, and I'm affiliated with a group called the Center for Agroforestry. And we are going to be talking today about a somewhat different way of taking advantage of natural variation that occurs within a tree species, a native tree species, that can be used for a specific set of purposes. And one of them is, the most important one is, to utilize these trees behind me, which we'll talk about in just a second, for the purposes of wildlife management enhancement. What am I talking about? I'm saying that this particular tree, it's an oak tree. I think everybody can see that from the images. It's a native oak tree, and it grows in every single county in the state of Missouri. It is called swamp white oak. The botanical name, which we'll get to in a bit, is Quercus. All oak trees are called Quercus, Q-U-E-R-C-U-S, and this one happens to be bicolor, bi meaning two colors. And we'll talk about how that came about here in a bit. Why am I excited about talking about Quercus bicolor swamp white oak trees that grow in every county in the state of Missouri to an audience like this? The purpose of this is truly a I'll call it a multi-purpose tree. How about that? It can be grown and harvested for its high quality timber, including to be used in cooperage industry, whether it be here in Missouri or other parts further east of here, like in Kentucky, for example, as well as, and this is the focus of our little story today, it produces an acorn. All oak trees produce acorns, we know this, and these acorns are produced in 1 year, not 2. Sometimes there are other oak species like red oaks that takes 2 years to produce a nut. This only takes 1. That's one of the big differences between white oaks and red oaks. Swamp white oak. If you think about the common name, well, okay, Mark, it's going to grow in the swamps, right? Well, yeah, it does. Does it grow in standing water? Not quite. If you think to yourself, the standing water, particularly in the winter season, the winter dormant season, if the water comes up this high, you might see swamp white oaks growing au naturel about that high. So it's right next to these riparian areas, as they're called. Think of American sycamore. That's a very common tree that you can see along these riparian stream bank type scenarios. Think also of black walnuts, think of green ash, think of box elder maple. You get the idea. So that's the kind of community where you can find them on the wet side of the spectrum. Unlike other species, swamp white oak, despite the common name, it does not just grow, at least in Missouri, it does not just grow where it is wet. It can also grow, I've seen it, I've worked with them before, with trees that grow on the highest of the highest hills in the state of Missouri. And it grows not only on the high hills, despite the common name, as well as in the wet. It grows across that whole continuum. Other species, for example, bur oak. I think everybody has heard about or can imagine, conjure up an image of what a bur oak is. At least in Missouri, bur oaks grow where it's wet. They sure do, where it floods. Like along the Mississippi River or along the Missouri River, which is just not even 3 miles away from where I'm standing. But they do not necessarily grow on the more, what's the word, mesic conditions. It grows where it's dry, grows where it's wet, but it doesn't grow in between. Okay, so that's bur oak. We're not going to talk about bur oak today. Swamp white oak we're talking about. So that's some of the basis for some of the backstory. Okay, why do we care about this tree? We talked about the potential for timber, or wood products, we'll call it that. Also, I suggested that wildlife management can be greatly enhanced for those people who are interested in land management applications for wildlife purposes, for the purposes of finding trees that produce acorns. Acorns is a food source for a number of wildlife species that are native to, again, Missouri and much of the Midwest, or even up in New England where I'm from. White-tailed deer is one of them. They absolutely love swamp white oak acorns, more than any other that I'm aware of in this state. And we have 30, 40 different species of oaks growing in the state, I think it's the number. But they like oak acorns from swamp white oak more than anything else. What else? Wild turkey. the Wild Turkey Federation, for example, other nonprofits, other land management, conservation oriented groups or individuals that work in those groups, with those groups, wild turkeys crave these acorns. So there's two reasons why this tree can be viewed as kind of a multi-purpose tree for the timber, shall we say, as well as the wildlife food source story, if you will. So, think about a story. If you think about producing these acorns on trees, okay, and if you read, every now and then I actually do this, read the literature, scientific literature, and you say, okay, how old does a swamp white oak tree have to be before it starts to produce any nuts? Innocent question. And if you read the literature, and some of it is quite dated, I will admit that, they'll say 20 years. And I'll say to myself, nah, I know better. How can we exploit variation within the species to identify and, shall we say, cultivate, in a setting like behind me, trees that will produce nuts not in 20 years, that's too long to wait. And if they produce nuts in the 20th year, do they produce on the 21st or the 22nd or the 23rd? Nope. They take a couple years off. They tend to be very sporadic in their tendency to produce an annual acorn crop in this case. So my interest was to look at these. This is an example, a story here, sorry, that we can examine, is there a genetic component, if you will, a selection component that people like me can exploit, is the good word I like to use, to get trees to not only produce nuts at age 20, you plant an acorn and you wait 20 years and that 20-year-old tree will start to produce its own acorns, so that's seed to seed, acorn to acorn timelines. Well, that's what the literature says. It's the old literature, okay? In this case, we went from the first year to the third year, and acorns were produced on some, not all, some trees. And by the time these trees were getting to about age 6, 5 or 6 years old, they didn't produce just one crop of nuts in the 6th year and then they took the next 3 years off. They started producing every single year. Okay, so that's obviously what we're interested in if we want to exploit this species, the variation within the species for this flowering and fruiting characteristic. So that's kind of what we're about, what the story is. You know, this is what the tree is, and we'll look at some close-up pictures a little later on about, you know, what we're looking at. Again, we're in the first 10 days of May in the year 2022, and you can see the phenology behind me. Can I see any acorns on the trees in May? Nope. You can see them in September, but they're just right now, just tiny, tiny little flowers, which we'll take a peek at if we have some time here to do that. And just to kind of as an orientation of what this species does and how it behaves, if you will. So, real quick, the trees behind me. Think of an apple orchard. Let's say that, pick your favorite cultivar of apples. Let's say it's Jonathan, a Fuji, or Gala. You get the idea. Those trees, all of those trees in an orchard setting, they're all grafted trees. Okay? In order to get Gala apples from 20 trees in a row, you have to have 20 grafted trees so you all get the same production, the same characteristics, the same harvest date. Okay, amongst those 20 trees, you have to propagate them from a grafted tree. Can you root them as a cutting? Sure, I guess, but there's a lot of attributes to a grafted tree which are expensive. They're hard to do. Apples are pretty simple, but in general, propagating trees that way is not easy. Can you grow them in tissue culture? Sure. Apples now. Is it advantageous to do it that way, or is it just easier to do it the old-fashioned way, you know, graft the trees like you graft a grape vineyard? Same thing. There are advantages that we can potentially get into later. The biggest trees to my left, all of these trees, 1, 2, 3 rows that are behind me, those are grafted trees. Okay, and let me look at my notes because I can't remember. There's too many dates. I grafted these trees, swamp white oaks now, forget the apple story. Grafted these trees in 2003. This is 2022. So I think if I can still do math, they're about 18 years old, okay? In this little grafted setting orchard behind me, there are a total of 4 different varieties, if you will, of swamp white oak. Varieties like a Gala versus a Jonathan versus a Fuji. 1, 2, 3 varieties, if you will, cultivars, whatever name you want to use it. So I have 4 in here. I started out with 8. Can you see there's a bunch of trees that are close together in a row, and then where I'm standing from here behind me, there's a big open space. Well, there used to be 8 cultivars in here, and the 8 cultivars, not all of them are productive as I thought they would be, and it's back in 2003. And so guess what? They're gone. So that's part of the story. I wanted to see if I grafted swamp white oak trees onto specific known origin seedling root systems, does that seedling root system have an effect in terms of producing acorns? Okay, in terms of the timing and how much over time, over years, how much is one more productive if you use this orchard, this clone, this cultivar variety, whatever you want to call it, if you put it on this understock source versus that understock source. Again, think of apples. You can have semi-dwarf, you can have dwarfs, you can have standard. Those understock sources can convey certain stature. Okay, they can also convey potential disease resistance in terms of root diseases in apples. In oaks, we don't know anything about this. So one of my interests were at the time in 2003 was to look at if there's an understock source that's better, quote unquote, or it can make a poor producer, acorn producer, better if I put it on this source versus that source. So that's what I tried to do. And so think of 8 different varieties, and they were put on 6 different sources of seedlings, understock. So 6 times 8, 48. That's you know, for this little bit of land here, it's a very small little planting. That's what we tried to do. It was just a kind of a trial, if you will. And so the take-home message is, number 1, I had 8 different clones that I started with, varieties, and then over time, then they produced acorns, yeah, but they didn't produce anywhere near what the other ones did. So they're gone, okay? And the question of the understock source, the rootstock, the seedling that you graft a tree onto, on top of, did that have an effect in terms of productivity, acorn productivity? And the answer is, drum roll please, the answer is no. The good ones are good, the bad ones are bad. You can put them on 6 different understocks. It doesn't matter which understock you put them on. When they all rank over time, the good ones are good. It doesn't matter what source they're on or not. Okay, so that's something that was, you know, we check that box. I mean, we now know that. So the good ones, you can select them for acorn productivity. And if you do that, it's going to perform well whether you put them on source A, B, C, D, E, F, G, source of seedlings. You can even put them in oaks. You can even put them on different species. That gets to be really weird. But for example, remember that bur oak story I told you about? Can you graft swamp white oak onto bur oak? Absolutely. And in some cases it might be advantageous not for productivity but for survival. If you get bur oak from where they grow in the bottoms, where they can grow in standing water much more readily than this species, you may be able to gain an advantage by putting them on a bur oak understock versus a swamp white oak understock. So that's the long-winded story on these trees that we're looking at behind me. So the next objective is, and we're going to move from where I'm standing to another section of the planting, and we'll talk a little bit more about the biology in terms of the flowers, and so maybe we can get a little better understanding of that. And again, sorry guys, it's in May. In September we'll come back and we can potentially look at the same trees again and say, okay, you can see all the flowers, and now how many flowers actually resulted in nuts, because that's not a one-for-one, guys. In many cases, I know, not necessarily in swamp white oak, but in another species I work with, Philip, very much, is black walnut, eastern black walnut, Juglans nigra. Does it mean, is there a story here in terms of the flowering? The numbers of flowers versus the numbers of nuts in a given year. Just because you had 100 flowers on, these are the female blooms that are resulting in a fruit, in a seed, in an acorn, in a walnut nut. just because you have 100 flowers, and you can count them, I mean, it takes a little bit, but you can do it. If you count them, and then you come back to the same tree in, 3, 4, 5 months later, and then you count the nuts. Nuts are a lot easier to count than the flowers because the flowers are so small. But trust me, that the take home there is that there are some trees that it'll be not quite 1 to 1, 100 flowers, 100 nuts. There's some that'll produce 100 flowers, 0 nuts. And it doesn't matter what they produced the year before, if they produced any. You get the idea. So there's another whole long-winded story there in terms of exploitation of the flowering story versus the fruiting story. And but we can talk about that another time. But so for now, if it's okay, we're going to move from here where I'm standing to, we'll set up a little bit further into the orchard area, and then we'll talk about the flower story. And then after that, we need to talk about, oh boy, so we've got this orchard story, which I'm going on and on about. What about when you grow these seeds, the acorns that you produce from these trees right here, and you grow those seedlings up, what did they do when it comes to producing acorns? Does it take them 20 years to perform the way we are hoping that we've noticed that the parents, how do they mimic the parents? And so we'll talk about that